Hello and welcome to the Astranti Top 10 Most Likely Unseen Issues for the Strategic Case Study exam taking place in May and August 2021. This is the final video in our pre-scene analysis series, apart from the industry analysis video. And in this video, as the name would suggest, we're going to go through the top 10 most likely issues to come up in the exam. And we are usually right 70 to 80% of the time with these issues. That is to say that in the previous times we have recorded these top 10 most likely unseen issues, 7 or 8 out of the 10 issues has arisen in the exam. And before we begin, we're going to look at why I have chosen these as my top 10 most likely unseen issues, and also how you can use these issues to prepare for your exam to make sure you're in a really good position for passing the exam in May or in August. We'll start by looking at the basis of the choice, and that relates to the focus in the pre-scene. How much a certain topic has come up in the pre-scene, or also has it been mysteriously removed from the pre-scene? Has it been omitted from the pre-scene? Whereas usually a big issue like this is very relevant to the company or very relevant to the strategic syllabus. So, for example, if there is a lot of space devoted to a particular issue, or if there is a lot of mentions of it throughout sporadically, then it's perhaps likely to be somewhere where the examiner is heading. And also, I'm thinking about the degree of importance attached to it by the examiner. So, for example, in this case study for our field, the airport owner-operator, there was a lot of talk about this whole idea of noise pollution. It appeared in the risk reports, it appeared we're talking about the actual airport itself and its operations. It then appeared in the articles at the back of the pre-scene. So some sort of question relating to either ethics or corporate social responsibility is quite likely based on the fact that that particular issue has arisen several times. Also, the strategic importance of a particular issue as well. So the importance to the SWOT analysis that we conducted in the previous video, and we mentioned various different strengths and threats and weaknesses, etc. as we were going through the pre-scene video. Something that is really crucial to the organization, a strength to the organization. Anything that is a threat to that strength would be a likely issue as well. Also, the importance that's likely to be attached to it by the directors of the organization. So the directors of the organization want to provide sustainable growth to the shareholders. So anything that's going to be a threat to that sustainable growth for the shareholders is likely to be important as well. And finally, my own experience as well. I've been teaching the strategic case study for 4 years now. And prior to that, I was the tutor for the operational and the management case study. So I've seen many different pre-scenes over the years. I've seen many past exam papers as well, the kinds of issues that appear time and time again in the exam, and the typical issues that you will generally face at the strategic level. And also based on how easy it is to examine certain questions. Because remember, the people writing the exam are people as well. They're going to write questions that are really good to write about. Ones where they can test a range of things at once and they can construct really decent, logical questions easily on. So that's the basis of my choices here for these top 10 issues. And before we begin, just look at how you can use these issues to prepare for your exam. And the first thing you need to do is to prepare key models from the pre-scene information on these issues. So if we're talking about external factors, if we're talking about the industry, the competitiveness of the industry, then think about your Porter's 5 forces, think about your Pestel analysis as well, and adapt these models based on the points that are raised in the pre-scene and also based on the issues that we discuss here. Then sit mock exams that cover those key issues as well. And in general, just sit as many mock exams as you can. We provide them here at Astranti, but there are also ones on the Pearson VUE website, and there are also other tuition providers that provide mock exams as well. And to best prepare you for the exams, sit as many mocks as you can, because they test everything. They test your knowledge, they test your planning ability, your time management ability, your writing ability as well. So it's really good practice to sit as many mock exams as you can. Also, find real life examples and prepare paragraphs based on those. Now, we provide lots of those in our industry pack, but you can also find it just from general research online as well. For example, the case here, Arfield, particularly with regards to the Capital City International Airport and the Capital City MAX Airport. A good way, particularly if you're based in the UK, which I know a lot of you are, is to think of it as if it was the same company that owned, say, both Gatwick Airport and Heathrow Airport. And think about the power that that company would have for services and flights in and out of London. And also think about some of the issues that have faced those airports. There's the Heathrow Airport expansion, the new runway, the various different issues that has caused. And that actually mirrors a lot what's happening at Capital City International, where there are 2 runways and there are no more flight slots available. The only way to add more would be to expand the runway, and what kinds of issues that could cause. So that's a real life example that could be used here if we're talking about expanding Capital City International Airport. Then learn some of the typical key points for these issues, perhaps the advantages and disadvantages of implementing certain systems or using certain models, or what could go right, what could go wrong if they were to acquire another airport, etc. And finally, be prepared to use models that support the issues as well. So think about your stakeholder matrix, think about your ANSOS matrix, and think about your suitability, acceptability, feasibility models as well, how you would use those models to construct answers based on the issues that we provide. So that's an introduction. Now let's kick off our top 10 issues with issue number 10, which is on ethics. Now, ethics is incredibly important to the strategic case study exam. The reason why it's one of my big top 10 issues is because of this fact that it is one of the most commonly examined SCS topics. It appears in most SCS variants. In fact, since March 2015, when the case study exam was introduced, there has been an ethics question in 40 to 60% of the exams that have been sat. And that's not to say 40 to 60% of the sittings, but 40 to 60% of the actual exams. So if you have 5 variants per sitting, there are actually 2 or 3 variants per sitting that will have an ethics question in. So it is very, very important. And ethics pretty much gets into my top 10 issues purely based on the fact that it is so commonly examined. But on top of that, there is also focus on it in the pre-scene, particularly with regards to the environment and noise pollution, which links to corporate social responsibility, in the various different vision and mission and value statements provided by the organization as well. There was a lot of talk about trying to do what they can, be safe, be secure for everyone, to keep our promises, to create sustainable growth as well. And given the nature of the industry, given the nature of the company, an airport is an inherently very dangerous place to operate, there is a natural tie-in with health and safety as well. Even if it wasn't specifically mentioned, we could infer that health and safety was an issue in this case. And then likely issues, again, would relate to safety, it would relate to pollution, the environment, the noise that is created by the airport's operations, the fact that we are after sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability? With regards to an airport company, it says sustainable growth, but also we need to be sustainable for the planet as well. We need to perhaps look at ways in which we can report on our sustainability and environmental reporting as well. Look for ways which we can offset the carbon emissions that are produced by the airport. Now, of course, the company has taken steps for this already. They have limited times when the planes can be used. So they can't fly after 10 o'clock and they can't fly before 6 a.m. in the morning because of the noise pollution. And also we are not allowing airlines that have planes that are too loud to land and take off from our airport. But there are other things that we could do. We could look into different community projects and environmental offsetting projects as well to reduce the emissions and reduce the impact on the environment. And one thing they could definitely do away with, and this came up in the pre-scene a couple of times, was this idea of ghost flights, where planes are taking off and landing with no passengers simply because an airline has basically not been able to use that slot because of maintenance to a plane, or the route is currently not available for whatever reason. But because they don't want to lose their takeoff slot, they randomly just fly a plane every single time that slot takes place, just to a destination not far away, purely to keep that slot in use, because airports cancel slots if they are not used. Now, surely there are ways around that. They could just pay us for the slots, pay us the fees that they would have paid had the plane been full, rather than, or pay for the passengers if they had been full of passengers, etc., rather than actually have the plane taking off and landing. Because then it's not really costing the particular airline company anymore, and it's not costing us revenue because we wouldn't be earning the passenger fees, etc. anyway, but it also would be less impactful for the environment. It seems like such a huge waste to have all this emissions coming in from a plane taking off and landing, even if it's only making a short journey, just to keep a slot open. There must be ways around that. We can't force airlines to be doing this because it seems like such an environmentally unfriendly practice. There are also health and safety that is important, particularly within airports. We've got the security codes in place to stop people being able to get places that they shouldn't be. We've also got a lot of training that we'll have to make sure they have, and everyone has to have the right training before they can go to certain places. Security, very important. Airports can be quite dangerous places with regards to criminal and terrorist activity, etc. So all these things are key issues as well, and we have an obligation, a duty of care to all our stakeholders. And key points to bring up here is that SEMA expect you and want you to be highly ethical. You must always take the moral high ground and act from an ethical perspective. And I advise you to do this in both a long and a short-term format, because remember, this is the strategic case study exam. You're not just fighting fires, you're not just dealing with things as and when they arrive. You are supposed to be dealing with issues full stop, stopping them from happening again in the future as well. Thinking to the future, thinking like a senior manager. So, for example, if someone is injured because of whatever reason, in the short term, you might just deal with that issue. For example, we'll just change the safety procedure so this particular incident doesn't happen again. But that's only half of it. What you might then want to do is consider how you stop any similar issues from arising in the future, such as new equipment, better training, making sure that you do better background checks, for example, to make sure that something similar doesn't happen in the future, rather than waiting for someone to be injured and then dealing with that very specific issue. You preempt what could go wrong and find ways to deal with it before it happened, to deal with it preemptively. And just a point here on being ethical, SEMA expect you, within the context of this exam, to always take the high ground, and they expect you to be completely ethical. Everything that is not ethical is unethical. And what I mean by that is anything that's not completely ethical is unethical. Now, in reality, we know that ethics can be quite a grey area. There is degrees of pragmatism that have to be dealt with, etc. But in the context of the exam, you want to think of ethics almost as black and white. It's either completely ethical or it's completely unethical. And always make sure you fight from the ethical side. CIMA will not like it. You are not acting like a CIMA accountant that's bound by the CIMA Code of Ethics if you are trying to justify something that is unethical. And relevant theory you could use, then of course the CIMA ethical principles is the key one here. Integrity, confidentiality, professional behavior, objectivity, professional competence, and due care. An examiner report actually said you could use this model when answering ethical questions almost all of the time. But remember that you have a lot to do in only limited amount of time. So if there is an ethical issue, you might mention the ethical principles, you might even mention the 5 principles of it. But if it's a confidentiality issue, only talk in detail about confidentiality. Don't spend ages putting several paragraphs about what integrity is and several paragraphs about what professional behavior and objectivity is, etc. if it's a confidentiality question. Only focus on the ones that are actually going to earn you marks, because that is the only one that is going to be answering the question. If it's a confidentiality question, only write about confidentiality. Another model you can use is the the American Accounting Association Resolution Model. Now, of course, this is not in the CIMA syllabus. For starters, it is an American model, not in the CIMA syllabus, not in the CIMA model. But it is useful for identifying the ethical responsibilities of you as a company by asking yourself these certain headers. So, do you owe a duty of care? Do we owe a duty of care to our passengers, our customers, our employees, etc.? What was the end result and was it bad? And is it a breach of any of our values, such as integrity or fairness, or specifically looking at the values of our field? It could be to do with delivering on promises. It could be to do with safety and security as well. And also, what is the cultural norms? So what are the rules and regulations within Norland? And another good phrase to use is, it's simply the right thing to do. Ethics may not always be profitable or as profitable as something else, but it's still the right thing to do. You have to do the right thing as a CIMA qualified accountant, as a senior manager. So ethics is always relevant, and I advise you to consider ethics for almost any question that you answer in the exam. Now on to issue number 9, and this is another issue that appears all the time. And the reason why it's also very important is because it often ties in with other questions, and that issue is funding. Now, funding is part of your role in the CIMA SCS guide. It's your job to consider strategic options, consider risks, etc., and consider appropriate sources of finance. It's specifically mentioned as something you are supposed to do within this case study role. And it's also something that's very easy to link to other questions. So, for example, you might have a question about expanding the passenger terminal, etc. And that makes sense because cash will be needed for this. There's information we've been given about the current cash position and debt level, etc. at the organization. So how are we going to source appropriate funding for this? Can we afford it in cash? Can we take out more debt funding? Is it so much that we might even need to raise through additional equity funding, etc. as well? So it's a very likely question, and something that even if it won't come up as its own question, in fact it's quite unlikely to come up as its own self-contained question, is that you'll need to consider where you source finance from for any project. If you're given a project, you're given a net present value or something like that, and you're asked to say whether or not we should go ahead with this project, always consider how it's going to be funded and consider the appropriate and most appropriate way to fund it. So if it's only a few tens of millions of Nordland dollars, probably just pay for it in cash. We've got over 2 billion in the bank. But if it's going to be 2 billion, We can't afford to spend all of the money that we have in the bank account because, of course, that's going to be needed for a lot of contingencies. It's going to be needed for working capital, etc. So we might need to raise additional debt funding. But what if we can't get any additional debt funding because of our gearing rate or because of our finance costs already being so high? Then where else could we get it from? Could we get it from private investments, or could we get it from rights issues and things like that? All those sorts of things you need to discuss. It's your role as a senior manager. So like the issues are to be with regards to a long-term funding requirement, such as organic growth, perhaps purchasing or building a new airport. It could also be through an acquisition or new projects going on within the airports themselves. Or it could be more shorter term to raise additional working capital, perhaps that some of the liabilities have fallen due and we don't have enough of the assets available, current assets available to pay off those liabilities, and therefore we need to perhaps arrange an overdraft or something like that to meet our short-term working capital requirements. Key points to bring up from the pre-scene here, and it's always useful to pepper in some of these figures from the pre-scene because it demonstrates to the examiner as well that you have read the pre-scene, you've understood it, and you're using and referring to it in your answers. So at the 31st of December 2020, the company had over $2 billion Nordland dollars. It had $2,167 million Nordland dollars in the bank. But a lot of that will be needed for working capital. Remember, our current liabilities, the money that we owe, is already over $1.5 billion. So we're going to need a lot of that cash for those current liabilities. And also, given the expense of everything in this industry, it's likely that we're going to need a lot of surplus cash lying around for negative cash flows or also for other working capital requirements or as contingency as well. We don't want to have no money in the bank and find that we need to fork out for $500 million Nordland dollars worth of repairs to an airport or something like that. Debt funding is at medium levels at the moment, so it's 28.7% or 40.2%, depending which method you use, so the long-term debt over equity or long-term debt over long-term debt plus equity. There's no right or wrong answer as long as you specify which one you use. And that is significantly lower, though, than our competitor. So if we look at the gearing rate of Skylane, it was actually far higher. The gearing rate of Skylane was 50.4% or 101.6% depending on the methods that you use. So the gearing rate was quite low, but the finance costs were very high. So the finance costs in the year 2020 for our field were actually almost $2.5 billion Nordland dollars. And that actually works out around a 13% interest rate, which is incredibly high considering that we have almost 20 billion in long-term borrowings. And so despite having a 40.4% operating profit margin, which is very high for a company in an industry with a lot of physical assets, it's actually a huge proportion of that being lost to finance costs. In fact, the finance costs almost 25% of the revenue that we generated in this year. So that's why we actually only have a very low interest cover of 1.72. We can only actually pay off the interest that we owe on our borrowings 1.72 times with our entire annual operating profit. So that could render it quite difficult to raise too much additional debt funding given our high interest rates at the moment. So it could be that we need to find a way of consolidating our debt or find a way of reducing our interest rates. Relevant theory to use here, for starters, you would put your lenders, your equity providers, shareholders, etc. and your MENBLOs as important stakeholders. Bank usually goes in the low interest, high power. Key shareholders go in the high interest, high power. And so you put those in there because you know that you have to pay your interest and you know that your shareholders are going to want a return on their investment. And you could also compare debt and equity funding. So debt's usually much quicker and is a much lower cost way of raising funding. But it sometimes isn't useful for massive amounts. If we needed billions and billions of Nordland dollars in extra funding, it may be more appropriate to raise it through equity funding. Although that is more time consuming and more expensive, you do not have to pay dividends. Dividends are optional, although we have high dividend rates at the moment of 60%. So we do not actually need to pay that back. So it could be that taking out additional equity funding, particularly if we need a lot of money, is a valid option given our high finance costs. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have enjoyed it, and more importantly, you have found it useful. Just going to take a moment to tell you about the courses that we produce here at Astranti for our case studies. And all of the products that you see here are available as standard as part of the course, but they are also available for purchase individually. We have the Exam Technique series, which is a study text and a video series which looks at how to plan your answers, how to read the material and analyze the material effectively, and to manage your time effectively in the exam, which is incredibly important. Most people who fail the case study exam fail it because of poor exam technique. So that's a really important video series for you to watch to ensure that you've got that technique. Because there is a specific technique to sitting the case study exam, and all will be revealed in that video series. And do head over to the website for more information about it. We then have our theory revision series, which again is a study text and a video series, and that looks at the specific theories that are relevant to the case study, because a lot of the material from the E's, the P's, the F's won't appear in the case study. It's only specific topics that are frequently tested in the case study. So to save you from revising all the E's and all the F's and all the P's, we've created a more condensed revision series to refresh yourself of the knowledge that you'll need for the exam. We then have our pre-scene analysis series, which looks through the pre-scene page by page, bringing out the important points. In addition to that video series, there is also a video that looks at the top 10 most likely unseen issues, and also the strategic analysis video, which takes all the key models from the CIMA syllabus and applies them to the case. We then have our industry analysis pack, which is a large document that looks at the industry that the pre-scene is based on, looks at all the real companies that are actually operating in that actual industry in the real world, looks at how they market, what the suppliers are, what the key stakeholders are, how they operate, industry trends, and also a series of industry examples that you can use and reference in your exam. And we've got sample paragraphs to show you how you would use it in the exam, and that's a document. There's also an accompanying video with it. We have our mock exams, which are based on actual exams, but they feature the reference to the actual case, so they're on the actual case that you will sit the exam on. We've done our best to make them as close to the actual exams as possible, and you can actually sit those online in an online system that replicates the one that you'll use on the exam day. So you can really test yourself under exam conditions, and we provide marking and feedback for those mocks as well, where you'll get a tutor that will analyze your script and will give you a comprehensive document providing you with information not only on your actual script, as in whether you passed and failed and what you should have brought up and what you shouldn't have brought up, etc. But we'll also give you an appraisal on your technique as well, how to improve your exam technique. We then have our question packs, which is a series of shorter mock style questions based around the core activities. So if you find that you really struggle with certain parts of the CIMA syllabus, that will be a really good way for helping you. For example, if it's the core activity A's that you're always struggling with, or the B's that you're struggling with, you can look at the specific core activity A pack, which will give you questions based on those subjects. And then we have our masterclasses. We have 2 live all-day masterclasses one at the start of the course and one at the end of the course. The one at the start of the course will give you all sorts of hints and tips on how to plan, how to use your time effectively. We'll also go through the planning process live, which will be really helpful for you as you progress into your mock exams. And then we have the revision masterclass right at the end, which looks at everything you've covered, gives you a refresher on everything you've covered over the 6-week period. And that's going to be really useful for giving you those little extra hints and tips to get you the extra marks in the exam. So do head over to the website, www.astranti.com, for more information about those. And I hope to see you again for the next video.